I have the task of introducing somebody who needs no introduction to this audience at all. So Peter's going to talk to us about my family's history in India. Well, his anyway.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for that kind introduction. I have to start off with 2 or 3 apologies, if I may. First apology is for my dress, because I planned to come rather more smartly dressed than I have at the present time. This is my driving attire, that we haven't been able to change. And the second thing is that I'd like to say that I'm going to tell you about my family history, and I apologise that there's no flashman type of characters in this. There's no people with VCs to be awarded, and so I'm looking forward to talking to you about some very ordinary members of my family who did actually serve in India over 100 years or so or more. I want to start off by saying that in my history I've always been fantastically passionate about family history, no matter where they came from. But of course, the ones that went to India and served in India are rather special to me. When I was a very young man, I learned that from my father that his father had been born in India. And I was fascinated by this, but decided that it wasn't actually immediately practicable to find out more about him at that stage. And so I left it for a few years and found that my family in India were amongst the people in green there, and all he could tell me were the people in green. I know that my grandfather, whom I never met sadly, was born in India in 1879. He went to St Joseph's, Bangalore, where he was educated, and that's about all I knew. And all I knew that his father was obviously called Bailey of some sort. I knew about Grandma, who was actually my father, Maurice Patrick Bailey's grandma, was called Grandma, and that she had married a man called Dallison, who was his second husband. And that's all I knew. Apart from, I should mention that Lawrence Philip Bailey, my uncle, did actually serve in the Fleet Air Arm during the war, and he went out to India to serve in their waters. But that's all I knew. So anyway, I then started on trying to find out as much as I can in traditional ways, and learned that the records of the India, people who served in India, births, marriages, deaths, etc., were to be found at the India Office records, which, of course, as you all know, or you might have known if you're as old as I am, that the records were, the Indian Office records were kept in the Commonwealth Records Office as long ago as 1961 when I started this. And they are, of course, in King Charles Street at the opposite end of Whitehall. And that's where I went. And first of all found, here we are, found then the marriage of my grandfather, Sergeant James Bailey, who was in the 45th Regiment, and he married a lady called Anne Evans, who was 22 at the time. And she lived in Blacktown because her father was just about retired from his work, and living in Blacktown, very close to Fort St George. And the only other person, her name was Evans. Her father's name, of course, was Edward Evans. And among the signatures of the witnesses were one William P. Evans. I wondered who he was, but I would like to call your attention to the certificate was issued at Commonwealth Record Office in King Charles Street in November 1961, so that tells you how old I was at the time and how old my interest was in family history. I then went on to search for, and this time I got the information from the New Record Office in the British Library in 96 Euston Road, and found that my grandfather was born in February 1879, at which time his father was promoted, if that's the right expression, to commissariat sergeant, so he was out of the army in particular. You all remember, of course, having taught you so many times, that the commissariat department was filled with people from the ranks of the senior non-commissioned officers of the British Army who volunteered to transfer, and obviously my grandfather had done that. So then I just started to research a bit more about my grandfather from his War Office records from the 45th Regiment where he first joined the army, and found out that fairly soon after he joined, he did about a year or so of initial training, and was then called upon by the British government to visit India. And here's a picture of the ship which he took him to India. There was a ship called the Donald Mackay, which happened to be an American ship. We noticed on the date that 1864, when he first went there, that 1864 was in the middle of the American Civil War between the North and the South, and what they used to do in those days was to hire some of their ships for good cash to various worthy causes, or people who were prepared to pay the cash, and they hired this ship to the British authorities, military authorities, and it took him to Bombay, where he went first of all. Sadly, I've not ever been able to find a copy of a photograph which shows James Bailey, so when I do have a photograph of a number of these soldiers, and this was taken at the regiment his regiment in Pune in 1865. That's the only picture I've got. Well, I can't pick out which one he's in, but he's probably one of those gentlemen in the picture. Now, shortly after they were stationed in Pune, in fact it was as long as 3 years I think afterwards, the British government did a deal with the Emperor of Ethiopia. I don't know how many of you might be aware of the story of Ethiopia and the Abyssinian War which we held in those days. But the Emperor considered, he was quite mad, he considered that the Russians were going to come and overtake his country, and so he wrote to Queen Victoria saying, please Queen, come and send your army here who, we understand will be able to defend me against the Russian army. And Queen Victoria didn't quite know what to do with this letter, and so she sent it to the Prime Minister, who sent it to, sent a reply to say, look, I'm sorry, you've got these 8 British missionaries, that's all you've got, 8 in your country at the present time, and you've locked them up on the understanding that I'm going to come and keep them in prison until you do. So the world's press got to hear about this, and they all said, well, what are you going to do, British government? You've only got 8 people, what are you going to do to get them out? And so in true British gunboat diplomacy, he thought, well, we've got to do something, we can't just do nothing and let these 8 people rot in prison in this place, middle of nowhere. So he wrote to the Commander-in-Chief of the Indian Army in Calcutta and said, look, we'd like you to go and get them out for us. So get as many soldiers as you feel is necessary, and go to this place called Magdala, which is where they're all in prison, and get them out. And there's a lot of humming and hawing and saying, are 8 British people worthwhile saving for the sake of the enormous amount of energy, of money and resources this is going to cost? And so eventually he said, yes, okay, I suppose I've got to do this. And so they planned an expedition to Magdala. Now, they had to put load some ships in Bombay, sail them across to the mouth of the Red Sea, as you can see there. And on the Red Sea coast there was a place called Annesley Bay, which nobody had ever heard of before or since. And they built a whole town, I mean a whole town, including railway locomotives and everything to move the stores around, and to use that town as a base for attacking Magdala. And from there onwards inland, it was about 400 miles or so to Magdala to go and get these people out. And so various pictures were taken at the time. First of all, there's an Abyssinian campaign here, with elephants being embarked. They took elephants with them to drag the guns with them. And the next picture shows in the Abyssinian campaign, that's the sort of land, the sort of terrain that they had to cross with their army just to get to Magdala. Very, very inhospitable, and the temperature, of course, as you can imagine, I think this is close to one of the contenders for being the hottest place in the world at the time, and it was at that den. And you can see pictures, if they're clear enough, you can see little elephants trotting up and down, and in the right hand side there, that's en route to Magdala. Then, before they got to Magdala itself, they actually decided that the emperor has got enough of his army in place that he wanted to, he was prepared to fight to resist them. And so there's a place called Aragi outside where half of the army, which had arrived there already, were prepared to fight against the emperor. And eventually, to cut a long story short, that's what it is. Anybody who's interested in finding out much more about this escapade should read a book called The Blue Nile by a man called Alan Moorhead, who describes this in some detail, this whole campaign. And so when they finally got to Magdala, which I haven't shown here, and they attacked the city, the emperor by that time had committed suicide and encouraged most of his soldiers to do the same by throwing them off a cliff. And so they released the prisoners unharmed at that stage and able to bring them back to safety out of Ethiopia. And so the whole journey was reversed on the way back to Annesley Bay, and then they sailed back to India. This campaign of 1868 was by Sir Robert Napier, who was Commander-in-Chief of the British Army. Indian soldiers in this undertaking were 13,000. Number of horses were 3,000. Bullocks, 16,000, you can read the story. And elephants, 44. So it was quite an effort to get all that lot over to Ethiopia and then down to Magdala. And the cost was estimated to be about £8.6 million. Well, that, as I said, was the measure of British gunboat diplomacy. You know, you didn't mess with the British Empire. You did what you were told, and they were prepared to spend a lot of time and effort in coming to get you if you put them in prison. And there were, of course, medals associated with this. Each sort of soldier got a medal, including my grandfather. great-grandfather who won this medal. I've never seen or heard of what happened to it. I suspect somehow that it's buried with him in the graveyard which we've come across. But if I did get a chance to get that medal, I'd love to get it, because that was the only significant operation that he was involved in. And having embarked again at Annesley Bay, they sailed back to India, not to Bombay, as I mentioned before, but this time to a place called Fort St George in Madras. Well, that's a modern picture of Fort St George, and I think those of us who went there 3 or 4 years ago will remember what it was like. And just close to Fort St George, there was St Mary's Co-Cathedral, which was taken about the same time when I travelled to India. People nowadays may recognise this church, which has been renamed, I think, to St Anthony, and the records are all there. And I was able to see the original record. You can't read that perhaps terribly well, but what it says was that the James Bailey and Evans, the same record, the same information as I got from the British Library in London, except the name Bailey is spelled B-A-I-L-Y with no E. The Army, the British Army, put the E in because that was the conventional way of spelling Bailey at the time. And I think we know that there are other ways of spelling Bailey, as Peter and Julia know. All three occasions where it's actually down in writing were B-A-I-L-Y at the time. Now, I believe that they must have got married in a bit of a hurry, not for obvious reasons, but because they fell in love, and James was about to be transferred from Madras to Burma. Just shortly after that, that was in the last days of 1871, the last days of 1871 or early 1872, he was then sent to Burma, to a place called Theitmeo, and he must have gone across the sea from there to Rangoon, and Rangoon up the Irrawaddy River to this place which was actually the frontier of British Burma at the time, 1874 or 5 it was, before they expanded into the rest of Burma. But at that time he went to spend some time in Theitmeo, and I believe the first child of the couple was actually born there, and I suppose baptised there. We have no references to this. We've looked a bit at the records of Rangoon or even Theitmeo to find out if he was there, but with no luck. And so that's the first of his children whom we've got a name for, but we couldn't find in the records. And having spent 3 or 4 years there, James unfortunately started to become rather ill. He transferred, as I mentioned before, to the unattached list, or to the Madras unattached list, and then he travelled over several places in southern India where other children were born, and sadly he had a total of 6 children, and only 2 of them survived, the first one and the last one. The first one was named William Edward Bailey, who I mentioned on the screen, and the second was Arthur Patrick Bailey in 1879. The others, all boys they were, and the other boys unfortunately passed on, so they didn't survive. And James didn't survive much longer because, having joined the Madras Commissariat Department, he then passed on to another world, which is that. That's his gravestone in the cemetery, the island cemetery, which people may know. We have visited there we certainly did in 2015, and we saw that there again. Mind you, it's much more crowded because there are many, and they're very active people, the Catholics in Madras, and they buried any spare space, spare part of land, they would bury somebody else, and so it's surrounded by almost difficult to find. So that's the first information we got about the family of Bailey. But we having got there, we've been able to fill in a few blanks into the chart, but not many, to be perfectly honest. Now, so the next question is, well, we've learned about Anne Evans. Who was Anne Evans? We've all learned so far she was born in 1849. Father was called Edward Evans, and the witness to their wedding was William P. Evans, who turned out to be her brother, as a matter of fact. So when I was in the records office at the British Library, I did find that the following records were actually available. 1840 to 1856, but there's a big gap in the middle between 1844 and 1854. So that's when Anne was baptised, and she doesn't appear in the records. For those few who might be frequent visitors there will know that those records are lost. They didn't appear in the British Library. I'm not sure if they ever did, but we certainly find them there. So I decided, well, that's where we've got to look for the birth date of Anne. Headquarters of the Madras Artillery was actually only about 8 or 9 miles outside Madras, and that's what it looked like. Not quite as late as early as 1840s, but certainly not too long afterwards. And it was a beautiful, beautiful building, looking like that. It was at the foot of St. Thomas Mount. Incidentally, for those of you who don't know, St. Thomas was St. Thomas the Apostle, doubting Thomas, and he went there and he converted the Indian people, started to, until they finally revolted against him, and they actually martyred him close to St. Thomas Mount, where the church is now. So that was a picture of St. Patrick's Church at St. Thomas Mount. I was going on to tell you that St. Thomas Mount Catholic Church was built originally in 1837, but it's not the original church, because in 1943-ish, I think it burnt down, and the Americans, who happened to be in Madras at the time, helped to pay for it to be rebuilt. We also noted that the records of the parents had changed. The first three were records of Edward and Teresa Evans, and from 1844 onwards, the records are all Edward and Catherine Evans. So presumably that meant that his first wife had died, and there's the confirmation of this, which I actually found not very easy to read, but Teresa died at the age of only 20, probably caused by her giving birth to the second child, in the Catholic Cathedral. So that's why we were able to get a photograph of it. Now, Antonio and Catherine Ross, which were her parents, were well-known people, and they even had a plaque to their memory in the Catholic Church at that time, the Catholic Cathedral, which has subsequently disappeared. I don't know what happened to it, but so we didn't get a picture of that. So October the 21st. Now, so Edward's first wife having died, very quickly he married a second wife. And there's the entry from the church record which shows that. So February 1843, Edward Evans married Catherine Evans. The E is European, W is widower, and E is European again, and S is spinster. So he married a spinster who turned out to be the advanced age of 14 years. But that's not recorded there. I've put this slide up because I'm quite proud of this fact. I see that John Kendall, who was a staunch member of our FIBIS group, has not been here, but in reference to him, I've put two records, two entries, one after the other immediately, and you'll see that the one at the top is to an ancestor of his who was also called John Kendall, and he was corporal of the 63rd Regiment, and he got married at the same place almost just less than a month or so before my wedding between Edward and Catherine. So there we are. John, good luck to you. That's it. You're welcome to have the copy. So there. Who was Edward Evans then? Because he's our ancestor. He goes up in line with us. He was a Madras effective supernumerary. It's a difficult word to say. And he was a sergeant instructor, a laboratory sergeant, and a sub-conductor eventually, and eventually he became a conductor. So who was he? Then I decided that we ought to look at the other records, both in England before he joined the army, and then went to India. And here's the information that I was able to find about it. He joined at the age of 19. Well, he said he was 19. In fact, he was more like 17 and a half, which was very common in those days, as you would understand, to lie about their age. All the information about him and his recruitment. And there's a picture of what I suspect he looked like in the Madras Army as an artilleryman. He joined, first of all, as an infantryman. Then, as soon as he landed, they asked him to join the artillery, which he was happy to do. So he chose the Madras presidency. He was allocated to a ship called the Thames, embarked in 6th of March 1829. Infantry was what he joined, and he landed at Madras in June 1829. And there's more information about his I don't want to keep you too long, so I'll go through that fairly quickly. That's the information I got from the Elmwell 17.3 records, which are not as commonly consulted as they should be. But if you want to find out what happened to your ancestor, particularly if you joined the effective supernumeraries in that time, then he would find this information there. And finally, it goes up to 1863, where he was transferred to the pension establishment, and he continued to live in Madras. That is an extra slide I've got here, which I found at the record office of the British artillery, a picture of St Thomas Mount and how it was organised and set out, and you can see from if you can read it, all of the bits and pieces of the different bits of training they had to undertake in the Madras artillery.
Peter, could I just ask what year that is? What year is that?
That year, that I think was about 1840 actually. Now, at the top of St Thomas Mount, as I mentioned, there was a Portuguese church erected by the Portuguese in, wait for it, 1543. That's what it looked like. And it's still there, although they've danced it up quite a little bit. And actually, not too far away at the bottom of the hill, on the other side from St Patrick's, there's the Anglican church was built in 1828, and that's probably where Edward Evans would have gone to church first of all. Remember, as he joined, he was an Anglican, and he got baptised in the Anglican Church, and that's where it was. Those of you who accompanied us on the 2015 tour of India will remember that we could not find this church anymore. I've subsequently learned that the top of it has been taken off to allow aircraft to land. It's on the flight path of the Madras airport. So the pilot taking it off, they decided to do it themselves. But it's a shame they couldn't find it. Now, so Edward had two families. The first family was with Teresa Ross, and they were married in 1839, had two children, Emily, Catherine, and Emily married a man called Roskell, John Roskell, and went away, I suppose, not nearby to work. And sadly, John Roskell, Emily died first of all, when the children were either not born, or sometimes they were born and died again. And Edward and Catherine married separately and went eventually to Australia to a man called Nolan, where the mutiny had stopped, and the East India Company Army was wound down, as you may remember, and so he decided to take his money or bonus, I suppose, and go out to India to the goldfields, which he recently discovered there, and their family has grown into quite a significant size, and we have found references to them. But Emily had two children. One was also called Emily, and the other one was called Catherine. No, it was called Elizabeth. And John Roskell, before he died, after Emily had died, John Roskell wanted them to be sent back to England to his older brother, who was a JP in North Wales, and he got Sergeant Savage to take him back to England, much against the wishes of Edward Evans, who was their real grandfather, one he knew, and he didn't prevail, I'm afraid. There was the death of Emily Roskell, which I got from him, and here was where they were buried, probably in St Thomas Mount Cemetery, but we know they were. Sadly, you can see, given the state of the cemetery, I didn't venture in because people kept warning me about snakes, and I was scared of snakes, and decided to put that one behind, because I think we've got some other records of that, who's in that cemetery, in the British Library, and that's another transcription we can do for everybody's benefit, is to record the names of all those people who are buried in that cemetery. Edward Evans wrote back to George Roskell, JP, his other grandfather, his children's other grandfather, and wrote to them and said, we disagree with it, but the army authorities have decided to send them back to England, and so we're doing that for you. Please let us know, write to us and let us know that they arrived safely. And this is a copy of a letter that I've got from Edward Evans with his signature as a conductor of ordnance at Fort St George, And so that was a very important find for us. We found this by Hermione, who was sort of related to us, and I'll show you how. We sent this letter off, which my daughters did that. We sent it off to a handwriting expert and got his character understood from the handwriting. Now I think it might be a bit of a laugh, but I think if you can get that done as possible, if possible, I recommend it to you as a way of determining the character of this man. And he turned out to be a pretty nice fellow, I have to say, and I've got the character written out for me at home. That is the getting about the bottom half, but the top half was actually reported in FIBIS journal. I can't remember number 8 of it. Hermione Ann O'Neill, who found this information. We copied it with her. We wrote an article for the FIBIS journal with all that in. And we also found that that's a copy of Mary Ann, who was the youngest of the two children. She was only about 2 or 3 when she left India. And James Bridges, who she eventually managed, who joined the Indian Civil Service. I'm not quite sure how they met, but that's a picture of them. Now, the second family, Edward Evans and Catherine Evers, they had several children. Child 1 and 2 was William Peter, William WMP, remember he was a witness at their wedding, and Mary Evans, who became Mary Morrison, and she married her, and we came across her as well. We never came across William Peter, but Mary Evans' granddaughter we've come across. And that's a picture of Ian Harris, her husband, and Mary Morrison, who were descended from them. They stayed in India until the partition, and then they came to live in England, and we found that out in England. And this is other members of the family, Kelly and Anne Dennison, which is one of the only couple of pictures I've got of my great-grandmother, Anne Dennison. Very proud of that picture, as you can imagine. And then children 4, 5, 6 and 7 were also descended from their marriage. And child number 3 was Anne Cecilia Evans, which is my great-grandmother. It gives a brief synopsis of her history. But another picture which I'm terribly proud is this, because that shows you who these people are, indicated on the right, and at the centre, underneath, a lady with her hand on his head, was my grandfather, aged about 4, which I'd never seen before, and I was absolutely delighted to receive that, you can imagine. And on his right, in the right-hand picture corner, was Uncle William Edward Bailey, of whom I'd heard and knew about, but didn't know anything else about him. But in the centre of the picture itself is Catherine Evers. She is the lady who married Edward Evans at the age of 14. She had been born in Bangalore, well, just 14 years beforehand, and there she is at the age of 60-something. She passed on to about 1893. What did Edward do as well? Edward was involved in several different things. First of all, he wrote a book called The Officers of the Late Madras Artillery. It's like a sort of compendium, if you could You can see a copy if you go to the British Library, it's not easy to find, but a more modern version written by another gentleman it supersedes it if you want to ask for the addresses of the Madras artillery. But anyway, that is a copy of the original book that he wrote. He also did drawings, because he was a sergeant instructor, and he did drawings to help the book. I think this was by Captain Oates, who was his boss at the time, and I've taken out from the hammer, the bottom is EPE, shows Edward Paul Evans. He actually copied that was his writing. Other things that he did when he was retired, he helped to administer the Soldiers, Widows and Orphans Fund in Madras. And finally, he comes to his death in 1872. Well, that's fine, all well. Okay. So let's see, who was Catherine Evers? She was a 14-year-old who married him, who happened to be transferred with her father just before she reached 14, when they were, of course, liable to be not thrown out on their ear, that's an unkind expression, but removed, if you like, from the protection of their parents, because they were deemed to be able to make their own way in the world. And so, first of all, I said, well, who was Catherine Evers? Where can I find more information about her? And so I, first of all, was lucky enough to find information about the Madras female asylum, which was where the orphans went in about 1839, and trawled through the list of people. There are about 600 which I've transcribed and which now feature on the database. And so was she an orphan? Was she a soldier's daughter? Well, she turned out not to be an orphan, so she must have been a soldier. Well, that's the information I've transcribed. And so we looked for her in the Madras Army, all members in the Madras Army, and we found that she wasn't a Madras military female orphan. There was one medical apprentice who was, when I quoted earlier on this afternoon, that was a medical apprentice. He was actually an apprentice, and one company soldier who was available at the time was Peter Evers. He was aged at 39, he was married, and he recently arrived at St Thomas Mount. And so there was Peter Evers, but there was frequent mention of another lady called Margaret Evers, and that worried me no end, because I thought, oh, Peter Evers I knew before. He had brought his wife to India, and her name was Mary. So who's this Margaret? Okay, so we found out eventually that Peter Evers was born about 1805. He married a girl called Mary in 1826. He was a weaver, and he enlisted in the army as an artilleryman. And the wife gave birth to a daughter called Mary just before sailing for India. And they sailed in a ship called Minerva, and he landed with his wife and child on the 24th of August 27. There's a picture of the Minerva. And continuing with Peter Evers' CV, I've got number 5, that his wife died. Now what I think happens, and I look for information to Debbie Kennett, who hopefully has helped me resolve this, that he married a girl, that his first wife died, certainly they landed together, and they were sent on their way to Bangalore together when they did land. But she must have died very shortly after that. And having done so, of course, if the baby was still alive as well, the baby was in sore need of a mother, or Peter was in need of a mother for her, and so he necessarily decided it was important for him to get married a second time. Now, at the second marriage, whereas I thought originally that Mary was the real mother of Catherine, it turns out, as far as I can see, very strongly that the second wife was called Margaret, and that she was an Anglo-Indian. And as I, in my analysis of my own DNA material, I have something like 2% of Anglo-Indian blood in me. So I didn't know where that came from until recently. I worked it out. That's the only place it really could have come from. I've got my other ancestors are traced at that level fairly easily, and that must have been where it came from. I haven't heard of any other children by Margaret, but I think that's where it must have been. And then Peter went on to his career to fight in the coup campaign. You may have heard of this. And then finally he decided, having lost two wives, I suppose by now, because we can't find the death of Margaret, he collected his pension, first of all in India, then London on the way back, and he sailed back to London in the Vernon. And then the records continue. His pension, as was possible, was paid by the government in Ireland, actually. Now I have visions of him landing, getting to Bombay very quickly. It took about a fortnight, I suppose, to work there. And if she didn't die en route, then she must have died, I think, fairly soon after he got there, because the birth of Catherine is so fairly quick after they did get married. And so he must have travelled between the hospital, which is H, and the B, which is the barracks, and the RC chapel, because obviously he was a Catholic. And so he very often made that journey, I would say. There's the capture of Coorg, where the Coorg Raja had been a bit nasty to his subjects, and the king sort of said, well, if you don't stop being nasty, we're going to come in and sort you out. And he didn't stop being nasty, so they went in and sorted him out, and they sent the army from about 4 or 5 different directions there, including from Bangalore, to sort him out. And that was in 1834. Then finally, the ship called the Vernon was there, taken back to England, or back to Ireland, I suppose. And so now we can summarise again what happened to the other families. So it's a bit fuller now, including Peter Evans and Margaret Christian Martin. I didn't know what the second name was. And they must have got married about 29. Now, while this was going on, or after it was going on, Anne Evans and her new husband, Henry Edward Dallison, decided to retire when he came to retire, and to retire to Bangalore, which was a sort of hill station, I suppose, which was a bit more comfortable climate, I suppose. And so we visited the church where she would have gone to church, and we were proud enough to find this following. St Patrick's Cathedral in Bangalore, it was called Cathedral, it's not just a church, I think. And the Lady Chapel, well, I think it's that bit that sticks out. Yes, that bit that sticks out. That's the Lady Chapel. And inside the Lady Chapel, there's this record of the plaque erected to memory of Mrs. Hayes Ellison. That was my grandmother. At that time, of course, that's what her name was. And I have to say that amongst the number of times that I've cried my eyes out when I visited India, that was one of them when I first came across that. It really ties you down to links with people who living all that time ago, all that way ago. And then also in Bangalore, Arthur Patrick, whose father had died, he, as a very young man, young boy, went to St Joseph's Varsity College with it, confirms what my father had told him. And it's now called St Germans. If anybody ever visits there, they know where St Germans is, but not the fact that it was formerly St Joseph's College, which is now in a separate part of Madras. So that's the information that I got. Now, finally, what happened to William Edward Bailey? Because we found out everybody else who we were related to, and found their links. But the William Edward Bailey, which is the older of the two boys in the family picture, I have to say that about 3 or 4 years ago, was it now, I was giving a lecture on British India to the Mormons. And the lady came up to me afterwards and asked the organiser, would it have been possible for me to go out and see her? She was in a wheelchair, which was sad. And so I went out, of course, to see her. And Tricia, my wife, came out a short time later to find out that we had our arms wrapped around each other because she was the granddaughter of William Edward Bailey. She came out to me and said, do you know about William Edward Bailey? And I said, yes. I hadn't spoken about it during the talk. And I said, yes, I do. And so we got together and we went to see her, and she finally showed us the story about her family. And I've got that information from her family, of who was married to whom and so on. And I learned out finally that her grandfather had joined the East Indian Railway Company. He'd worked as a railway shunter, and they don't appear in the records, in the Indian Office record, as you perhaps know, because having been born in India, they're privileged only to have the people who were born in England who went out there. But that wasn't a picture of him, incidentally, but a picture of a nice train found in it. And then a picture of which I'm equally proud is a picture concocted from one of my pictures of Anne Evans and myself around the famous plaque that I mentioned in the in St Patrick's Cathedral. And here ends, I think, the first long lesson.
I read somewhere, but I don't know where, that army officers would get some money from the army for their young daughters until they were 14. And then when they were 14, they would be married off because they weren't getting any more money for them. Would that be why, you were talking about these girls who got married at 14 or 15,
Broadly, yes. Because all the soldiers who had an official wife, and most of those who were allowed to take their wives in England with them were official wives, they were given official status, and their wives had an allowance for being their wives, and any children were given an allowance also for up until the age of 14, as I say. That's why, since that was a sort of cut-off point, most of the women in particular got married at 14. When you can imagine, well, what can you do when you're 14 and you're out in the world? You've got to fend for yourself, and that was very difficult. And so these girls came up for auction, if you like, and it made me literally an auction to assure their future. And my grandfather was, great-grandfather was, I think, 39 when he married his 14-year-old wife, which is something which people will frown about now, but it was very, very common those days.
Well, this isn't so much a question as a comment on what's just been said about daughters being married off at 14. I think it's maybe an indication of the class distinction, but I think daughters of officers got a rather different deal. I know for a fact that daughters of officers of the Indian Navy continued to receive a pension until they died if they did not marry. As soon as they married, that pension ceased. So at the Indian Joint Office records, I forget why I was looking, but I was looking at the pension records of the Indian Navy, and there were still people. The Indian Navy was abolished, I think, in 1861, but there were still daughters of Indian naval officers drawing a very small pension, just a few shillings, still drawing a pension in the 1960s. I don't know, but I suspect that the same may have applied to the daughters of officers of the Indian Army. Do you know, Peter?
Yes, they did. In fact, the pension records are extremely interesting to look at. And when you look at the officers' pension records, they record, of course, the wife, when and what her previous name was, when she got married, where she got married, and so on. And each child, as is born, was also entitled to a mention in the pension records. And until she died, or till she got married. Yes, I think until she got married. So if there were some unmarried daughters, they did get pensions as long as 1960.
Yeah, and what's more, if an officer remarried after retiring to England, daughters of the second wife, they also got a pension.
Yes, right.
But you had to stay unmarried, girls.
Any other questions? Yes?
Yeah. A very simple question, Peter. Where do you find pension records? Is it?
In the Indian Office records at the British Library.
Is there a reference number in one of the booklets out there?
I'm sure there will be somehow, yes. Yeah. For a genealogist, as you can understand, those records are particularly very interesting and useful.
If that's all, I think Peter's looking a bit tired at the moment. I think you need a bit of a rest, Peter.